The first time I saw the lights on the hill, I thought someone was having trouble with their car. It was nearly midnight, and I was driving home through a rural part of northern Maine. The road was narrow, surrounded by thick pine trees, and there were no houses for several miles in either direction. I had taken that road hundreds of times. That night, however, I noticed something I had never seen before. At the top of a hill, about half a mile ahead, 3 pale lights were moving slowly between the trees. They were too high to be headlights, they were too low to be stars, and they were moving in a straight line. I slowed down. The lights stopped. I waited a few seconds. Then they moved again. I remember laughing to myself because I was tired and probably imagining things. I had been working late for several nights, and the combination of exhaustion and darkness can make ordinary things look strange. So I kept driving. As I reached the bottom of the hill, the lights disappeared completely. I forgot about them by the time I got home. At least, I thought I had. My name is Daniel Mercer, and at the time, I had been living alone in a small rental house outside a town called Blackwater Ridge. The house was cheap for a reason. It sat at the end of an old logging road, almost completely surrounded by forest. There was one other house nearby, but the owner only came there during the summer. I actually liked the isolation. After spending most of my life in a crowded city, I enjoyed being able to step outside and hear absolutely nothing. No traffic, no neighbors, no distant sirens, just wind moving through the trees. That was why I ignored the first strange thing that happened. 2 nights after seeing the lights, I woke up at exactly 3:17 in the morning. I did not know why. There was no loud noise, no nightmare. I simply opened my eyes. The bedroom was completely dark. I reached for my phone and checked the time. 3:17. I was about to put the phone down when I heard something outside. It sounded like someone walking slowly through the leaves. 1 step, then another, then another. I sat up in bed. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I walked to the window and looked outside. My yard was empty. The trees beyond it were completely still. I was about to close the curtains when I noticed something near the edge of the forest. A small white light. It was just sitting there between the trees. I stared at it for several seconds. Then it disappeared. I told myself it had been a reflection. I went back to bed. The next morning, I found a muddy footprint on my back porch. It was not mine. I wore heavy work boots with a distinctive pattern on the sole. The footprint did not match them. It was also much smaller than my boot. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I noticed something else. There were 3 more footprints. They started near the forest. They crossed the yard. They stopped directly outside my bedroom window. There were no footprints leading away. I called the landlord. He came over that afternoon and looked at the prints. He did not seem particularly concerned. He told me that hunters sometimes walk through the woods and that somebody probably came onto the property by accident. I asked him why the footprints stopped at the window. He shrugged. Then he asked me something strange. He wanted to know whether I had seen any lights on the hill. I stared at him. I asked what he meant. He paused before answering. Then he told me that people had reported strange lights in that area for years. According to him, nobody knew what caused them. Some people blamed hunters. Others blamed illegal campers. A few locals had their own theories. I laughed and asked him whether he believed any of them. He did not laugh. He simply told me not to go looking for the lights. That should have been enough to make me take the whole thing seriously. Instead, it made me curious. The following weekend, I decided to drive up the hill during the afternoon. I wanted to see exactly where the lights had been coming from. The road became rougher as I climbed. Eventually, I reached an old metal gate. There was a faded sign attached to it. Private property. No trespassing. Beyond the gate was an abandoned service road leading deeper into the forest. I parked beside the road and walked a little farther on foot. After about 10 minutes, I found an old concrete foundation surrounded by trees. There was nothing left of the building except a few walls and a rusted metal chimney. I assumed it had once been a logging station. Then I noticed something carved into one of the concrete walls. It was a simple symbol. 3 vertical lines. Beneath them was a circle. I took a picture with my phone. I had no idea what it meant. I was about to leave when I heard a noise behind me. Someone whispered my name. Daniel. I froze. There was nobody there. I turned around slowly. The forest was empty. I waited for someone to step out from behind the trees. Nobody did. Then I heard my name again. This time the voice sounded much closer. Daniel. I ran. I did not stop until I reached my car. I drove home without looking back. That night, I deleted the picture of the symbol. I wish I could say that was the end of it. It was not. 3 days later, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I answered. Nobody spoke. I said hello twice. Then I heard a faint clicking sound. It sounded like someone tapping a fingernail against a piece of glass. I asked who was calling. A few seconds passed. Then a voice whispered one sentence. You should not have gone up there. The call ended. I immediately checked the number. There was no information. I blocked it. I convinced myself that someone was playing a prank on me. That explanation worked for about 20 minutes. Then I looked through the window. At the edge of my property stood a person. They were facing my house. They were too far away for me to see their face. They were completely motionless. I watched them for almost a minute. Then they raised one arm. They pointed directly toward my bedroom window. I stepped away from the glass. When I looked again, the person was gone. That was the moment I finally understood something. Whatever was happening around that hill had nothing to do with hunters, campers, or reflections. Something had noticed me, and somehow it knew where I lived. The next morning, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the person standing in the trees. Almost. There was just one problem. When I went outside, I found a second set of footprints in the dirt near the edge of my property. They were not there the night before. I followed them for several yards until they disappeared beneath the trees. I did not follow them any farther. Instead, I went back inside, locked the doors, and called my friend Marcus. Marcus was the only person I knew in Blackwater Ridge who would take something like this seriously without immediately making fun of me. I told him everything. The lights, the footprints, the phone call, the person standing in the forest. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Marcus asked me one question. Did you go to the old logging station? I told him yes. He became quiet again. I asked him why that mattered. He told me that his father used to work in the area when he was younger. Apparently, the abandoned building on the hill had not always been a logging station. Before that, it had been used by a private research company. Marcus did not know exactly what they researched. He only knew that his father refused to talk about the place. According to him, strange equipment had been transported there during the 1970s. People would arrive late at night. Large trucks would enter through the gate. Sometimes they would stay for days. Then, without warning, the entire operation disappeared. The company left. The building was abandoned. Nobody seemed to know why. I asked Marcus whether he knew the name of the company. He said he did. Then he gave me a name I had never heard before. North Star Field Research. I wrote it down. That afternoon, I went to the local library. I searched through old newspapers and public records for almost 3 hours. Eventually, I found an article from 1978. The headline was about a fire on the hill. The article said that a private research facility had suffered a serious electrical fire. The building had been evacuated. One employee was listed as missing. The fire department searched the property but could not find him. His name was Walter Hale. I kept reading. The article mentioned something else. Witnesses had reported seeing unusual lights in the forest on the night of the fire. I stared at the page. Those lights had been reported nearly 50 years ago. I searched for more articles. There were several. Most were short. Most repeated the same story. Unusual lights. Strange sounds. People disappearing from the area. Then I found something that made my stomach tighten. A photograph. It showed the old research facility before it burned. I recognized the concrete foundation immediately. But there was something else in the photograph. A group of researchers stood outside the building. 7 people. 6 of them were looking toward the camera. The 7th person was standing several feet away. His face had been scratched out of the photograph. Not blurred. Not damaged by age. Someone had deliberately removed his face. I took a picture of the newspaper with my phone. Then I noticed writing beneath the photograph. The caption identified the 6 visible researchers. There was no explanation for the 7th person. I closed the newspaper. I decided I was done. I did not want to know anything else. That evening, Marcus came over to my house. He brought another friend with him, a woman named Elise. She had grown up in the area and knew the local history better than either of us. When I showed them the photograph, Elise immediately recognized the building. Then she noticed the person whose face had been removed. She became visibly uncomfortable. I asked her what was wrong. She told me that she had seen that photograph before. Years earlier, her grandfather had shown it to her. He had worked as a mechanic for the research facility. I asked her what he had said about the 7th person. She shook her head. He told me never to ask about him. I asked why. She said her grandfather believed that the man in the photograph was not an employee. He was a patient. That word changed everything. I asked her what kind of patient. She did not know. Her grandfather had only told her that the researchers were conducting experiments involving sound, light, and human perception. He believed they were trying to determine whether people could be influenced by signals they could not consciously detect. I asked her whether the strange lights could have been part of those experiments. She said maybe. Then she looked at me and asked why I had gone up there. I told her about the voice. I told her it had spoken my name. Elise stared at the floor. Then she asked me something I had not considered. Did you ever tell anyone your name while you were up there? I said no. She asked whether there had been anyone else around. I said no. She asked whether I had seen any cameras. I said I had not. Then she said something that I still think about. If the place is abandoned, who is watching? Nobody answered. We sat in silence. Then the lights in my house flickered. Once. Twice. The 3rd time, every light went out. Marcus stood up. I reached for my phone. Before I could turn on the flashlight, we heard something outside. A low, mechanical hum. It was coming from the direction of the forest. We all moved toward the window. At first, there was nothing. Then, the lights appeared. 3 pale lights between the trees, exactly like the first night. Only this time, they were much closer. They moved slowly toward the house. Elise whispered that we should turn off our phones. I asked why. She said she did not know. She just knew that we should. We stood there in complete darkness. The lights continued moving. Then they stopped, right at the edge of the forest. Nobody spoke. A few seconds passed. Then something knocked on my front door. 3 times. Knock. 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 Marcus looked at me. I looked at Elise. Nobody moved. The knocking came again. 3 times. Then a voice came from the other side. Daniel. My entire body went cold. It was the same voice from the phone call. Marcus whispered that I should not answer. The voice spoke again. This time, it sounded almost friendly. Daniel, we know you are inside. Elise grabbed my arm. She was shaking. Then the voice changed. It became deeper, almost distorted, and it said something that none of us expected. Your mother is waiting. I felt my stomach drop. My mother had been dead for 6 years. Marcus knew that. Elise knew that. Nobody in Blackwater Ridge should have known. The voice repeated itself. Your mother is waiting. Then everything became silent. The lights in the forest disappeared. The power came back on. And there was nobody outside. We stayed inside for the rest of the night. At sunrise, Marcus and Elise left. Before Marcus got into his car, he told me something. He said I should leave the house. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. I asked him where I was supposed to go. He said anywhere. I laughed because I thought he was being dramatic. He was not. That afternoon, I packed a bag. I was going to stay at a hotel for a few nights. Before leaving, I decided to check the house one last time. Everything looked normal. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. Nothing had been disturbed. Then I noticed something on the kitchen table, a piece of paper. I was certain it had not been there earlier. It was an old photograph. I picked it up. The photograph showed the research facility from the same angle as the newspaper photograph. But this picture was different. There were 8 people standing outside the building. I recognized the 6 researchers. I recognized the faceless figure. But there was one additional person, a young man. He was standing at the far edge of the photograph, looking directly at the camera. I stared at him. I knew that face. It was my father. My father had never told me that he had been anywhere near Blackwater Ridge. He had never mentioned North Star Field Research. And according to the date written on the back of the photograph, he had been standing outside that building 3 years before I was born. I turned the photograph over. There was one sentence written on the back. Do not let him see the lights twice. I read it several times. Then I heard a sound from upstairs, a slow creaking noise. Someone was walking across the floor. I had been standing alone in the kitchen. I had not heard anyone enter. I grabbed my keys. I ran outside. I did not look back. But as I reached my car, I made one mistake. I looked toward the hill. The 3 lights were there again. Except this time, there were 4, and the 4th light was moving directly toward me. I drove for almost an hour before I realized I was not actually going anywhere. I had left my house because I was afraid to stay there, but I had no destination in mind. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner on the edge of town. I sat in my car with the engine running. The photograph was still on the passenger seat. I kept staring at my father's face. There was no reasonable explanation for why he had been standing outside that research facility. My father had always told me that he worked in construction when he was younger. That was the story I had grown up with. He had worked on houses. He had repaired buildings. He had done electrical work. Nothing about his past had ever suggested scientific research. I called him. The number had been disconnected years earlier. I had not spoken to him in almost 4 years. He had moved away after my parents separated, and eventually we lost contact. I searched through my phone for an old number. Nothing. Then I remembered that my aunt still had contact with him. I called her. She answered after several rings. I asked her whether my father had ever worked for a company called North Star Field Research. There was a long silence. Then she asked me why I wanted to know. I told her about the photograph. She did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was unusually quiet. She told me that my father had never worked for North Star. At least, not officially. He had been hired by them as a contractor. He was supposed to repair electrical equipment at the facility. That was all she knew. I asked her why nobody had ever told me. She said my father had made everyone promise not to talk about it. I asked whether she knew what they were researching. She said she did not. Then she remembered something. She told me that shortly after the facility closed, my father became obsessed with one particular subject, light. He started installing blackout curtains throughout the house. He refused to sleep with even a small light coming through the windows. He would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and stand outside, staring toward the tree line. My aunt said he would occasionally tell her that there were lights following him. She assumed he was suffering from stress. I asked her what happened after that. She told me something I will never forget. She said my father once told her that the lights were not lights at all. They were signals. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat in my car for several minutes. Then I remembered something. The old photograph. The note on the back. Do not let him see the lights twice. I suddenly wondered whether the person who wrote that message had been warning my father, or me. I went inside the diner and opened my laptop. I started searching for North Star Field Research. Most of the information I found was useless. Old business records, property documents, a few newspaper articles. Then I found an archived government document. It was heavily redacted. The title mentioned experimental environmental perception studies. I opened it. The document described a series of experiments involving controlled light patterns, extremely low-frequency sound, and human subjects. The goal was supposedly to study how the human brain reacted when exposed to combinations of sensory information that were difficult to consciously detect. I kept reading. One section described something called the Horizon Protocol. There was very little information about it. Most of the page had been blacked out. But one sentence remained visible. Subjects exposed to the signal demonstrated identical behavioral responses despite being physically separated. I read that sentence several times. Then I found another document. This one was older. It contained a handwritten note scanned into the archive. The handwriting looked rushed. The note said that the experiment had produced an unexpected result. The subjects were reporting seeing the same figure, a tall human shape surrounded by pale light. According to the report, the figure did not appear to be physically present. It appeared only when the subjects were exposed to the signal. Researchers initially believed the figure was a shared hallucination. Then one of the subjects described something that had not been part of the experiment. The subject claimed the figure was watching the researchers. The next page was missing. I closed the document. I wanted to stop. Instead, I searched for the name Walter Hale, the missing employee from the fire. I found a record. Walter Hale had been one of the primary technicians working on the Horizon Protocol. His employment ended on the night of the fire. His body was never recovered. Then, I found something much worse. The official report said that Walter Hale had been the only person inside the facility when the fire started. That meant there had been no reason for the other researchers to leave him behind, unless they had been afraid of something. I searched the archive again. Eventually, I found a scanned letter written by one of the researchers. The letter had never been sent. It was addressed to someone named Samuel Mercer, my father's name. I stopped breathing for a moment. I opened the letter. The first paragraph explained that the experiment had gone wrong. The signal was not creating hallucinations. It was causing subjects to perceive something that was already there. The researchers did not understand what that meant. The next paragraph was partially damaged, but one sentence was clear. We believe the phenomenon can recognize individual observers. I kept reading. The researcher warned my father that repeated exposure seemed to make the phenomenon more aware of the person observing it. The first exposure produced distant lights. The second exposure produced voices. The third exposure produced physical manifestations. Then the letter ended. There was no explanation of what happened after that. I stared at the screen. I thought about the 4 lights outside my car. I thought about the voice calling my name. I thought about the person standing in the forest. Then I remembered something. I had seen the lights twice. The first time was on the hill. The second time was outside my house. If the letter was correct, that meant the phenomenon had already noticed me. I decided to leave town. I drove to a motel several miles away and checked in under a different name. I did not tell Marcus where I was staying. I did not tell Elise. I turned off my phone. I closed the curtains. For the first time in days, I felt safe. That feeling lasted until 2:13 in the morning. I woke up because someone was knocking on the motel room door. 3 slow knocks. Knock. 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 I sat up. Nobody spoke. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I waited. Then another 3 knocks. I checked the security chain. It was still locked. I slowly opened the door. Nobody was there. I looked down. Something had been placed on the floor. An envelope. My name was written across it. Daniel Mercer. I brought it inside. I knew I should not open it. I opened it anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There were only 4 words. Your father went back. I immediately called my aunt. She answered this time. I asked her whether she knew where my father was. She hesitated. Then she gave me an address. It was an old cabin several hours north of Blackwater Ridge. She told me my father had owned it for years. I asked why she had never mentioned it. She said because my father had specifically told her never to tell me about it. I drove there before sunrise. The cabin was almost completely hidden by trees. There was no electricity, no vehicle outside. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything was covered in dust. It looked like nobody had lived there for years. Then I noticed a light coming from the basement. A faint white glow. I found the stairs. At the bottom was a small room filled with old equipment. Most of it was covered in dust, but one machine was still running. It had a small screen displaying a series of numbers. I stepped closer. The numbers changed every few seconds. Then the screen displayed my name. Daniel Mercer. I froze. A second line appeared beneath it. Observation level 2. I backed away. Then the machine began making a soft clicking sound. The same sound I had heard during the mysterious phone call. Click, click, click. A speaker beside the machine suddenly activated. A recording began playing. It was my father's voice. He sounded older than I remembered. He said only one sentence. If you are hearing this, then it already knows you are looking. The recording stopped. The room became silent. Then another sound came from behind me. A slow breath. I turned around. There was a doorway at the far end of the basement that I had not noticed before. Beyond it was complete darkness, and from somewhere inside that darkness, I heard my father's voice. Daniel. I did not move. The voice spoke again. This time it sounded exactly like my father. Do not turn on the light. Then the darkness behind the doorway moved. Something stepped forward. I could not see its face. I could only see the faint outline of a human figure surrounded by a pale glow, and for the first time, I understood what my father had been trying to escape. The lights were never coming from the forest. They were coming from something inside it.